The afternoon sun hung low over the sleepy town of Ridgeway, casting golden light across its cobblestone streets. Danielle adjusted her scarf against the brisk autumn breeze as she stepped out of the cafe. Her warm hazelnut latte was just a distraction, something to keep her hands busy as she tried to shake the nagging feeling that had followed her all week. Ethan hadn't been himself lately. Her husband of 6 years had always been an early riser, a meticulous planner, and the kind of man who left sticky notes with loving messages on the fridge. But for the past month those notes had stopped. His once familiar routine had shifted subtly, a late night at work here, an extra gym session there. Each change was small, insignificant on its own, but together they felt like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit. Danielle tried to ignore it, brushing off her unease as paranoia. Everyone goes through phases, she told herself. Yet as she walked home, the crisp air biting at her cheeks, she couldn't shake the memory of the strange text she'd seen on his phone last weekend. It had been brief, a single message that popped up while Ethan was in the shower. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was unforgettable. L." Danielle froze, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't meant to snoop, but the words burned into her mind, as clear as if she'd written them herself. Her fingers hovered over the phone for a moment before guilt overtook her, and she locked the screen. She didn't confront him, not then. Instead she waited, watching for something, anything, that might confirm or deny her growing fears. Now, as she turned the key in their front door, the house greeted her with its usual stillness. The scent of fresh lavender lingered from the diffuser in the living room, and the faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that filled the space. But it wasn't comforting, it was hollow. She set her coffee on the counter and leaned against the sink, staring blankly out the window at the darkening horizon. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from her best friend, Julia. "Hey, want to grab drinks tonight? We haven't caught up in forever." Danielle typed a quick reply, her fingers trembling. "Can't tonight. Another time." She wasn't in the mood for company. She wasn't in the mood for anything but answers. Upstairs, the bedroom was as neat as always, Ethan's military-like precision evident in the perfectly made bed and the meticulously arranged wardrobe. Danielle moved toward his dresser, her heart pounding. She didn't consider herself the kind of woman who would invade her husband's privacy, but desperation was a powerful force. As she opened the top drawer, her breath caught. There, tucked beneath a stack of neatly folded ties, was a receipt. It was dated last Friday, the night Ethan claimed to be working late, and it was for a dinner at La Riviere, one of the most expensive restaurants in town. Her name wasn't on it. A lump formed in her throat as she stared at the slip of paper, the numbers and details blurring together. Who was he with? Why hadn't he told her? Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. This time it was Ethan. "Hey, running late again tonight. Don't wait up for dinner." Danielle stared at the screen, her hands shaking. She knew she should respond, should keep the facade of normalcy intact, but her chest ached with the weight of her suspicions. She didn't reply. Instead, she slipped the receipt into her pocket and grabbed her coat. Danielle stepped out into the cold evening air, her breath forming soft clouds as she exhaled. The small town buzzed with life, its quaint streets lined with cozy restaurants and bustling shops. Yet, Danielle barely noticed any of it. Her focus was singular: finding the truth. La Riviere was only a 15-minute walk from their house. She hadn't planned on going there tonight. It wasn't the sort of place she frequented without a special occasion, but the receipt in her pocket weighed heavy, as though daring her to ignore it. With each step, her thoughts raced. What will I find there? Will anyone recognize me? The restaurant's exterior was a study in elegance, with its soft golden lights and wrought iron accents. Danielle hesitated by the door, suddenly aware of how out of place she felt in her simple coat and jeans. The hostess, a polished woman in her late 20s, greeted her with a bright smile. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" the woman asked. Danielle faltered. "No, I don't. I was actually wondering." She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "Do you have a record of reservations from last Friday? I think my husband might have forgotten something here, and I'm trying to track it down." The hostess's smile didn't waver, but her expression turned slightly guarded. "I'm afraid I can't share that information, ma'am. Privacy policy." Danielle nodded quickly, trying to mask her disappointment. Of course. I understand. She hesitated before adding, does the name Ethan Carrington ring a bell? The hostess shook her head, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition that Danielle didn't miss. Enjoy your evening, the woman said smoothly, gesturing to the door as a polite dismissal. Danielle stepped back into the street, her heart pounding. The hostess had definitely recognized the name. Ethan had been here, and she wasn't imagining things. But who had he been with? As she wandered down the street, aimlessly following the glow of shopfronts, she pulled out her phone and dialed Julia. Her best friend answered on the second ring. Danielle? Everything okay? I don't know, Danielle admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Can we meet? I need to talk to someone. Within 20 minutes, Danielle was sitting across from Julia at their favorite bar. The warm, cozy interior was a stark contrast to the storm brewing in her mind. Julia listened intently as Danielle recounted everything. The text message, the receipt, the hostess's reaction. Julia's dark eyes narrowed as she leaned closer. He's hiding something, Danny. You know that, right? Danielle sighed, her fingers tightening around the glass of wine she hadn't touched. I know. I need proof. I need to be sure before I say anything to him. Julia hesitated before speaking, her tone cautious. There's someone I know who might be able to help. A private investigator. Danielle's stomach flipped. A pie? Isn't that a bit extreme? Maybe, Julia admitted. But if Ethan's not telling you the truth, don't you want to know? And if you're wrong, if there's some innocent explanation, then at least you'll have peace of mind. Danielle stared into her glass, the amber liquid swirling as she turned the idea over in her mind. It felt invasive, like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. But then she thought of the receipt, of the text message, of Ethan's growing distance. Okay, she said finally, her voice resolute. Give me their number. The next day, Danielle sat across from Max Larkin, the private investigator Julia had recommended. His office was small and cluttered, filled with papers, coffee cups, and the faint smell of cigar smoke. Max himself was gruff but professional, his sharp blue eyes studying her intently as she explained her suspicions. I'll take the case, he said when she finished. Give me a week, maybe 2. I'll find out what he's been up to. Danielle handed him the receipt and a photo of Ethan. As she left his office, she felt a mixture of relief and guilt. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm ruining everything by doing this? But deep down she knew the truth. The cracks in her marriage were real, and they weren't going to disappear on their own. The following days were agonizing. Ethan continued his usual routine, working late, hitting the gym, coming home with that same polite but distant demeanor. Danielle tried to act normal, to smile and nod during their brief conversations, but the weight of her secret loomed large. She barely slept, her mind spinning with possibilities. Finally, a week later, Max called. His tone was clipped, professional. Danielle, I've got something. We need to meet. Danielle arrived at Max Larkin's office just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a dim orange glow over Ridgeway. Her stomach churned with nervous energy, her hands gripping the strap of her purse tightly as she walked up the narrow staircase to his second-floor office. The dimly lit hallway felt like a passage to a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Max opened the door before she had a chance to knock. His face, always serious, now bore a grim expression. He gestured for her to come in without a word, and Danielle's pulse quickened as she followed him to his desk. Take a seat, he said, sliding a folder across the desk toward her. Danielle hesitated before picking it up. What did you find? Max leaned back in his chair, his eyes sharp and unwavering. I followed your husband for the past week. He has a routine, like you said, work, gym, home. But Friday night, when he said he was working late, Danielle's throat tightened. She flipped open the folder and froze. The first photo was grainy but unmistakable. Ethan sitting in the corner of an upscale lounge, leaning in close to a woman with long dark hair. They were laughing, their faces just inches apart. That's La Riviere, she whispered, recognizing the opulent decor from her visit the week before. Max nodded. He was there with her for over 3 hours. Dinner, drinks, the works. When they left, they didn't go home. Danielle's heart sank as she turned to the next page. Another photo showed Ethan and the woman walking into a boutique hotel, their bodies close, his hand lightly touching the small of her back. The timestamp read 10:46 p.m. I waited until the next morning, Max said, his voice measured. They left together around 8 a.m. He dropped her off in a residential neighborhood before heading home. The words hit Danielle like a physical blow. She clenched her jaw, her fingers trembling as she stared at the damning evidence. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't paranoia. It was betrayal, plain and simple. Who is she? Danielle asked, her voice barely audible. Her name's Lauren Harper, Max said, pulling out a sheet of paper. She's a consultant who works with your husband's firm. They've been in contact for months, phone calls, texts, late-night meetings. It's not hard to connect the dots. Danielle closed the folder, her mind racing. Every suspicion, every uneasy feeling she'd ignored or rationalized now crystallized into cold, undeniable truth. Ethan was having an affair. Thank you, Max, she said, standing abruptly. I need to figure out my next steps. Max nodded, his expression softening slightly. Take care of yourself, Danielle. And if you need more help, you know where to find me. The walk home was a blur. Danielle's thoughts churned in an endless loop of anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. By the time she reached her front door, the cold evening air had numbed her face, but it did nothing to dull the ache in her chest. Ethan was already home, sitting in the living room with a beer in hand and his laptop open. He looked up when she walked in, his face lighting up in a smile that now felt like a mockery. Hey, you're home late, he said casually. Everything okay? Danielle stared at him, struggling to keep her composure. She forced a tight smile. Yeah, just had a lot on my mind. She didn't confront him, not yet. She needed time to think, to plan. This wasn't a conversation she wanted to have without knowing exactly how it would end. Over the next few days, Danielle carefully observed Ethan, her anger simmering beneath the surface. He acted as though nothing was wrong, as though their life was still intact. But now every affectionate gesture, every casual comment, felt like a lie. She reached out to Julia, her voice shaking as she recounted Max's findings. He's been with her, Jules. This woman, Lauren Harper. He lied to me about everything. Julia was silent for a moment, then said firmly, You need to confront him, Danny. You can't keep this bottled up. He needs to know you're not blind to what he's been doing. I know, Danielle said. But I want him to admit it. I need to hear it from him. On Friday night, Danielle set the stage. She prepared dinner as usual, keeping her movements deliberate and calm despite the storm raging inside her. Ethan came home at his usual time, oblivious to the trap she was about to set. As they ate, Danielle broached the topic with calculated precision. So, she began, her voice steady, how's work been lately? You've been staying late a lot. Ethan glanced up, his expression unchanging. Yeah, it's been busy. Lots of new projects. She nodded, her heart pounding. And Lauren Harper? Have you been working closely with her? For the briefest moment, something flickered across Ethan's face. Surprise, perhaps, or panic. But he quickly recovered. Yeah, she's on the team. Why do you ask? Danielle set her fork down, her hands trembling. Because I know Ethan. About her. About La Riviere. About the hotel. The room fell deathly silent. Ethan's eyes widened, and for the first time, Danielle saw real fear on his face. Danielle, he began, his voice faltering. It's not what you think. Don't. She cut him off, her voice sharp and laced with pain. Don't insult me by pretending this is anything but what it is. I have proof, Ethan. I've seen the photos. I know everything. Ethan sat in stunned silence, his fork still suspended midair. The words hung between them like a thundercloud, heavy and charged. Danielle's heart pounded as she held his gaze, refusing to let him look away. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind, but nothing could have prepared her for the raw emotion surging through her now. Danielle, Ethan finally said, setting his fork down. His voice was low, tinged with desperation. Let me explain. Explain what? Danielle shot back, her voice trembling with anger. Explain how you lied to my face? How you've been sneaking around behind my back. What is there to explain, Ethan? His face flushed, his usual composed demeanor crumbling. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, he murmured, running a hand through his hair. Lauren and I. Don't you dare say her name, Danielle interrupted, her voice like ice. I want to hear why, Ethan. Why you did this. Why you thought it was okay to betray me. He hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as if the words were caught in his throat. Finally he looked down, unable to meet her gaze. It wasn't planned, he said quietly. It started with work. We were spending so much time together and, I don't know, I got caught up in it. She made me feel. Don't finish that sentence, Danielle hissed, her hands clenched into fists on the table. Don't you dare sit here and tell me how she made you feel while you tore us apart. Ethan flinched, the weight of her words hitting him like a physical blow. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely audible. I know I've hurt you and I hate myself for it. But it didn't mean anything, Danielle. I swear. Didn't mean anything? Danielle cut him off, her voice rising. You spent the night with her, Ethan. You took her to dinner to a hotel. That's not nothing. Her voice cracked and she hated herself for it. She didn't want him to see her pain, but it was impossible to contain the tidal wave of emotions crashing over her. Betrayal, anger, heartbreak. It all spilled out in a torrent of tears she could no longer hold back. Ethan reached out as if to comfort her, but she recoiled, standing abruptly and stepping away from the table. Don't touch me, she said, her voice shaking. You don't get to comfort me, Ethan. Not after this. He stood as well, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. I'll do anything to fix this, he said. We can go to counseling, I'll cut things off with Lauren, whatever it takes. I don't want to lose you, Danielle. Danielle let out a bitter laugh, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. You don't get to decide that. You don't get to waltz back in here and act like you're the one who can fix this. You broke it, Ethan. You broke us. She turned and walked toward the stairs, her legs feeling like lead with every step. Ethan called after her, his voice cracking. Danielle, please. Don't walk away. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Upstairs, she shut the bedroom door behind her and sank onto the bed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The confrontation had left her feeling hollow, as though the foundation of her life had been ripped out from under her. She glanced at the wedding photo on the nightstand, the smiles they'd worn that day now a cruel reminder of what they had lost. For the first time in her life, Danielle didn't know what to do. Part of her wanted to throw Ethan out, to let him feel the pain of being cast aside. But another part, one she hated to acknowledge, still clung to the love they had shared, the life they had built together. Is it possible to come back from this? She wondered, staring at the photo through tear-blurred eyes. And even if it is, do I want to? The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. Ethan had slept on the couch, and when Danielle came downstairs, he was sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his eyes bloodshot and filled with regret. I'll pack my things, he said hoarsely. If that's what you want. Danielle hesitated, the words she wanted to say caught in her throat. She wasn't ready to make a decision yet. Not without more time to think. I don't know what I want, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But you staying here right now isn't helping. Ethan nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. I'll go to a hotel, he said. But please don't give up on us, Danielle. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. She didn't respond, simply watching as he gathered a bag and walked out the door. The sound of it closing behind him echoed in the silence, leaving Danielle alone with her thoughts. For the next several days, Danielle threw herself into anything that would keep her mind occupied. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, worked late hours at her job, and avoided social media like the plague. She wasn't ready to face the well-meaning questions or pitying looks from friends and family. Julia stopped by one evening with a bottle of wine and a sympathetic ear. They sat in the living room, the quiet hum of a jazz playlist filling the gaps in their conversation. What are you going to do? Julia asked gently. Danielle stared into her glass, the crimson liquid swirling as she turned it in her hand. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to cut him out of my life forever. But the other part, I can't just forget everything we've been through. Julia reached out, squeezing Danielle's hand. Whatever you decide, Danny, you don't have to go through it alone. I'm here for you. Danielle smiled weakly, grateful for her friend's unwavering support. But deep down, she knew that no one could make this decision for her. It was hers alone to bear. As the evening wore on and the wine bottle emptied, Danielle found herself scrolling through her phone. She stopped when she came across Max Larkin's contact. Her thumb hovered over the screen, an idea forming in her mind. She dialed his number. Danielle sat in her car outside Max Larkin's office, the engine humming softly as she gripped the steering wheel. The decision to call him hadn't come easily, but after days of restless nights and endless questions, she needed clarity, answers to the questions Ethan had danced around. If there was more to his betrayal, she was determined to uncover it. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and walked into the building. Max greeted her at the door, his expression neutral but curious. "I didn't expect to hear from you so soon," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "What can I do for you?" Danielle hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her bag. "There's more to this, Max. I can feel it. Ethan's been vague about Lauren, about how this all started. I need to know everything." Max nodded, leaning back in his chair. "You want me to dig deeper?" "Yes," Danielle said firmly. "I need to know who she is, why she came into his life, and if this was more than just a mistake." Max studied her for a moment before replying. "All right. Give me a few days. I'll see what I can find." The next 3 days were a blur of tension and waiting. Danielle threw herself into her work, but no amount of busy work could distract her from the looming uncertainty. Ethan called twice, leaving voicemails that alternated between apologies and pleas for forgiveness, but she couldn't bring herself to call him back. Not yet. When Max finally called, his voice was heavy. "I have something," he said. "You're going to want to see this." Danielle met him later that evening, her anxiety bubbling just below the surface. Max slid a file across the desk, his face unreadable. "What is it?" Danielle asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Max folded his hands on the desk. "Lauren Harper isn't just a consultant. She's involved in some questionable activities. Financial schemes, fraud, you name it. I did some digging into her past, and she's left a trail of destruction in every company she's worked for." Danielle frowned, flipping through the documents. "What does that have to do with Ethan?" Max leaned forward, his expression grim. "Lauren isn't just someone he had an affair with. She's someone who targeted him. From what I can tell, she's been using him to access confidential company information. Ethan might not even realize the full extent of it." Danielle's stomach churned as she stared at the evidence. Emails, financial statements, and phone records painted a picture far more sinister than she had imagined. Lauren wasn't just Ethan's lover. She was using him as a pawn in a larger scheme. "What do I do with this?" Danielle asked, her voice shaking. Max sighed. "That's up to you. You could take it to his company, but it'll blow everything wide open. Ethan's career, his reputation, it'll all be on the line. Or you could confront him and see what he knows. Either way, this is bigger than just the two of you." Danielle left Max's office feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Her anger at Ethan was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, fear. Fear of what Lauren was capable of, and fear of how deep Ethan might be in over his head. That night, Danielle sat at the kitchen table, the file spread out in front of her. She couldn't reconcile the man she'd loved for years with the mess that had unfolded before her. How had they ended up here? And more importantly, how could she ever trust him again? She didn't have to wait long for answers. Ethan showed up unannounced, his face haggard and his eyes desperate. "Danielle, please," he said, stepping into the kitchen. "I need to talk to you." She didn't invite him to sit. Instead, she stood with her arms crossed, the file still open on the table behind her. "Talk," she said coldly. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping. "I've been staying at the hotel, and I've had a lot of time to think. I know I've ruined everything, but I need you to understand this thing with Lauren, it was a mistake. I thought it was just, I don't know, a distraction. But it got out of hand." "Out of hand," Danielle repeated, her voice rising. She turned and grabbed the file, slamming it onto the counter between them. "This isn't just out of hand, Ethan. Do you even know what she's been doing? What she's dragged you into?" Ethan's face paled as he glanced at the documents. "What is this?" he asked, his voice trembling. Proof, Danielle said. Proof that your little fling wasn't just about late-night dinners and hotel rooms. She's using you, Ethan. She's been stealing from your company. And you're the perfect idiot she needed to pull it off. Ethan stared at the papers, his hands shaking as he flipped through them. I didn't know, he said weakly. I swear, Danielle, I didn't know. Didn't you? Danielle shot back. You chose her, Ethan. You chose to trust her, to lie to me, to destroy everything we had. And now look where it's gotten you. Ethan sank into a chair, his head in his hands. I didn't think it would go this far, he muttered. She said it was harmless. Just some consulting work. Danielle's laugh was bitter. Harmless? She's a criminal, Ethan. And now you're tied to her. For a long moment they sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Finally, Ethan looked up, his eyes red and glassy. What do we do? He asked, his voice barely audible. Danielle stared at him, her emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and exhaustion. She said. There's no we anymore, Ethan. This is your mess to clean up. And if you think for 1 second that I'm going to save you, you're more delusional than I thought. She grabbed the file and walked toward the door, her steps resolute. Fix this, Ethan. Or I will. She left him sitting there, his world crumbling around him, and for the first time in weeks, Danielle felt a glimmer of control over her own life. Danielle woke the next morning to a phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. She squinted at the screen. Ethan's name glared back at her. She let it ring. When it stopped, a voicemail notification appeared, but she ignored it. Whatever excuses or pleas he had prepared, she wasn't ready to hear them. She sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing her temples. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind like a haunting melody. Ethan's shock, his trembling voice, the file spread between them like a crime scene. What now? She thought. The betrayal was enough, but now Ethan's actions or inactions had tied him to Lauren's schemes. Danielle didn't want to clean up his mess, but if she left it unchecked, it could spill into her life too. Her phone buzzed again, this time a text. We need to talk. Please. It's urgent. Danielle sighed and typed back. Meet me at the park in an hour. No excuses. Ethan was already sitting on a bench when Danielle arrived. He looked disheveled, his usual polished appearance replaced by rumpled clothes and dark circles under his eyes. When he saw her, he stood, but Danielle waved him off, taking a seat at the far end of the bench. You said it was urgent, she said, her tone flat. So talk. Ethan sat down, leaving a wide gap between them. I've been thinking about what you said. He began, his voice low. About Lauren, about how she used me. I didn't want to believe it, but you're right. I've been blind to what's really going on. Danielle crossed her arms, not ready to let him off the hook. And what are you going to do about it? Ethan hesitated, his hands fidgeting in his lap. I've been looking through my emails, my bank records. Anything that might connect me to her dealings. If I can prove I wasn't complicit, maybe I can salvage this. And if you can't? Danielle asked, her voice sharp. What happens if the company finds out before you have a chance to come clean? Ethan winced. I'll lose everything. My job, my reputation, but I deserve it. I let this happen. Danielle stared at him, searching for any sign of the man she used to trust. His remorse seemed genuine, but her anger still simmered beneath the surface. You've got one chance to make this right, Ethan. But don't think for a second that it fixes what you did to me. He nodded solemnly. I understand. Over the next few days, Danielle watched from a distance as Ethan began dismantling the lies he'd allowed to build around him. He contacted the company's legal department, confessing what he knew about Lauren's activities and offering to cooperate in their investigation. The fallout was swift. Lauren was fired immediately, her access to company systems revoked. A team of investigators began combing through the financial records, piecing together the extent of her schemes. Ethan's role was scrutinized as well, but his proactive confession spared him the worst of the repercussions for now. Danielle learned all this secondhand. Through sparse updates Ethan sent her via text. She didn't respond to most of them, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of knowing she still cared enough to listen. Her focus remained on herself, on finding a way to rebuild her life in the wake of his betrayal. One evening Julia stopped by with takeout and wine, her presence a welcome distraction from the chaos swirling around Danielle. "So," Julia said, pouring them each a glass of Merlot, "how are you holding up?" Danielle shrugged. "Some days I feel like I'm okay. Other days it's like the ground's been pulled out from under me. I keep asking myself how I missed the signs, how I let things get this far." Julia reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on Danielle's. "You didn't miss the signs, Danny. You trusted him. That's not a failure, it's just love. He's the one who failed." Danielle blinked back tears, grateful for her friend's unwavering support. "I don't know if I can ever trust him again," she admitted. "Even if he fixes everything with the company, how do I move past what he did to me?" "You don't have to decide that now," Julia said. "Take your time. Figure out what you want, not what he wants." Danielle nodded, letting Julia's words sink in. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't revolve around Ethan. A future where she could be happy on her own terms. The next morning, as Danielle sipped her coffee and scrolled through the news, her phone buzzed with a call. It was Max. "I thought you'd want to know," he said, his tone measured. "Lauren's been arrested." Danielle sat up straighter, her heart racing. "Arrested? For what?" "Fraud, embezzlement, identity theft, the works," Max replied. "The company turned over their findings to the authorities, and it looks like they've been building a case against her for years. Ethan's cooperation might have tipped the scales." Danielle's mind spun as she processed the news. Lauren was out of the picture, but the damage she'd caused still lingered. Ethan might have avoided criminal charges, but his professional reputation was in tatters. And as for their marriage, that was a wound that would take far longer to heal. That evening, Danielle sat alone in the living room, a quiet resolve settling over her. She pulled out a notebook and began writing, listing the things she wanted for herself. Stability, independence, peace. For the first time, her goals didn't include Ethan. When her phone buzzed with another message from him, she didn't open it. Instead, she set the phone aside, picked up her notebook, and began planning the next chapter of her life. One where she was no longer defined by his betrayal. The next few days brought a strange sense of calm to Danielle's life. A stillness she hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't peace exactly, her emotions were still raw, and the weight of Ethan's betrayal lingered like a bruise. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she could see a path forward. Her notebook had become her lifeline, each page filled with ideas, goals, and plans for the future. She listed everything she wanted to do. Things she'd put off for years because life with Ethan had always come first. Small things like repainting the living room and bigger dreams like taking a solo trip to the Amalfi Coast. With every entry, she felt a little more in control, a little closer to reclaiming the life she had almost lost. One morning, as Danielle was sipping her coffee, she received an unexpected email. It was from Ethan. Subject: "Please read. Danielle. I know I've said it before, but I'm so sorry. I've spent the last few weeks reflecting on everything, and I see now how much I've hurt you. I know it's selfish to ask, but I'm hoping you'll meet with me one last time. There are things I need to say, things I couldn't put into words before. I understand if you're not ready, but I'll be at Evergreen Park at 5 p.m. on Thursday if you decide to come. If not, I'll respect your decision. Always, Ethan." Danielle read the message twice, her heart pounding. Part of her wanted to delete it, to move on without ever hearing his excuses again. But another part, the part that craved closure, felt compelled to go. When Thursday evening arrived, Danielle found herself walking the familiar path through Evergreen Park, her steps slow and deliberate. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and freshly cut grass. She spotted Ethan sitting on a bench near the fountain, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked up as she approached, standing awkwardly and shoving his hands into his pockets. "Danielle," he said softly, his voice tinged with both relief and trepidation. "Ethan," she replied, her tone guarded. She didn't sit, keeping a few feet of distance between them. "You wanted to talk. So talk." Ethan nodded, taking a deep breath. "First, thank you for coming. I know I don't deserve it. I've been thinking about what you said about how I destroyed everything. And you're right. I did." Danielle crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "Go on." "I've spent so much time trying to figure out why I did what I did," Ethan continued. "And I think I think I was trying to escape something. Not you, he added quickly, but this version of myself that felt trapped. I thought I could find something outside of US that would make me feel alive again. But all I did was ruin the best thing I ever had. Danielle's chest tightened, but she held her ground. And Lauren? What was she? A distraction? A thrill? Ethan winced, the shame evident in his expression. At first maybe. But she wasn't who I thought she was. She used me, Danielle. She saw how lost I was and took advantage of it. That doesn't excuse what I did, but I need you to know I didn't go looking for her. It just happened. Danielle shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. It didn't just happen, Ethan. You made choices. You lied. You betrayed me. That wasn't Lauren. That was you. Ethan nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I know. And I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life. I don't expect you to forgive me, Danielle. I wanted you to know how sorry I am. For everything. For a long moment they stood in silence, the only sound the gentle trickle of the fountain. Danielle studied him, searching for any hint of the man she had once loved. He seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his actions. But even now, she wasn't sure if his regret was enough to undo the damage. I appreciate your apology, she said finally, her voice steady. But it doesn't change what you did. It doesn't change how you made me feel. I can't go back to the way things were, Ethan. And honestly, I don't want to. Ethan's shoulders sagged, but he didn't argue. I understand, he said quietly. I'll respect whatever you decide. Danielle nodded, the finality of her decision settling over her like a bittersweet balm. Take care of yourself, Ethan. With that, she turned and walked away, her steps feeling lighter with each passing moment. That night, Danielle sat in the living room, her notebook open on the coffee table. She flipped to a fresh page and wrote a single line. Book the Amalfi trip. For the first time in weeks she smiled. A genuine, unburdened smile. She wasn't sure what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like hers to shape. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, painting the living room in soft hues of gold. Danielle sat cross-legged on the floor, her laptop balanced on the coffee table. The webpage in front of her was a portal to a dream she'd long held but never pursued. She hovered over the confirm booking button for a moment before clicking it. A wave of exhilaration rushed through her as the confirmation screen appeared. Flight to Naples, Italy, departing April 10th. The Amalfi Coast was no longer just a fantasy. It was happening. The weeks leading up to the trip passed in a blur of preparations. Danielle immersed herself in guidebooks, travel blogs, and YouTube videos, piecing together an itinerary that promised adventure, relaxation, and a fresh start. For the first time in months, her focus shifted away from Ethan and the wreckage of their marriage. She felt like herself again, but stronger, more independent. Julia helped her pack the night before the flight, tossing out outfits that didn't scream Italian summer goddess. They laughed over glasses of Prosecco as Danielle practiced basic Italian phrases, her pronunciation earning playful jabs from her best friend. You're going to come back a whole new woman, Julia said as she folded a sundress and placed it neatly into Danielle's suitcase. Ethan who? Danielle grinned, clinking her glass against Julia's. Exactly. When the plane touched down in Naples, Danielle felt an electric buzz of excitement. She rented a car and made her way along the winding coastal roads, the azure waters of the Mediterranean stretching endlessly to her left. Every turn revealed breathtaking views. Cliffside villages with pastel-colored houses, lemon groves basking in the sun, and the glittering expanse of the sea. Her base for the week was a charming villa in Positano, perched high on the cliffs with a balcony that offered an uninterrupted view of the coastline. The air was warm and fragrant, carrying hints of salt, citrus, and blooming flowers. It felt like stepping into another world. Danielle spent her days exploring. She wandered the narrow streets of Amalfi, browsed handmade ceramics in Ravello, and hiked the path of the gods, her heart pounding not just from the exertion but from the sheer beauty surrounding her. She dined on fresh seafood and sipped limoncello under star-studded skies, savoring every moment of her newfound freedom. One evening, while sitting alone at a cafe overlooking the sea, she struck up a conversation with Luca, a local artist whose charm was as effortless as his English. They talked for hours, sharing stories about their lives and laughing over cultural differences. For the first time in a long time, Danielle felt a spark of something she'd thought she'd lost: connection. Luca invited her to his studio the next day, where he showed her his paintings. Vibrant, abstract works that seemed to capture the very essence of the Amalfi Coast. Danielle admired his talent, but more than that, she admired his passion. It was infectious, and she found herself opening up about her own life in ways she hadn't expected. "You have a strength about you," Luca said, his dark eyes warm and sincere. "It's in the way you speak, the way you carry yourself. Like someone who's been through the storm and come out stronger." Danielle smiled, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "I guess I have." The days turned into a rhythm of exploration and quiet reflection. Each morning, Danielle wrote in her journal, capturing her thoughts and dreams with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. By the end of the trip, she had filled pages with plans for the future. A future that was hers alone to shape. On her last night in Positano, she stood on the balcony of her villa, the soft glow of lanterns from the town below casting a magical light over the sea. She thought about Ethan, about how much she had loved him and how much he had hurt her. But instead of anger, she felt a surprising sense of peace. The betrayal was a part of her story, but it didn't define her. She had learned from it, grown from it, and now she was moving forward. When Danielle returned home, her friends noticed the change immediately. There was a lightness in her step, a confidence in her smile. She had shed the weight of the past and was ready to embrace whatever came next. Ethan too noticed. He reached out once, asking if they could meet for coffee, but Danielle declined. She had nothing more to say to him. Their story was over, and she was finally at peace with that. Danielle's return from the Amalfi Coast felt like crossing a threshold. She wasn't the same woman who had boarded that plane weeks ago, burdened by heartbreak and uncertainty. The trip had been transformative, a reset button on her life, and now she was ready to start fresh. Her first step was her career. For years, Danielle had settled into a safe, stable job at a local marketing agency. It paid the bills, but it didn't excite her. The passion she once felt for her work had dwindled over time, and now, in the wake of her newfound independence, she realized she wanted more. With renewed determination, she spent her evenings updating her resume, researching opportunities, and reaching out to old colleagues. It wasn't long before she landed an interview with a boutique agency in the city, one known for its creativity and dynamic work culture. On the day of the interview, Danielle stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the lapels of her blazer. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman who had weathered storms and come out stronger. She smiled to herself, confidence radiating from within. The interview went better than she could have imagined. The hiring manager, a sharp but approachable woman named Sophia, was impressed by Danielle's experience and vision. By the end of the meeting, she had offered Danielle the position on the spot. "I can already tell you're exactly what we're looking for," Sophia said with a smile. "Welcome to the team." Danielle left the office feeling lighter than air. She had taken a risk, stepped out of her comfort zone, and it had paid off. This new chapter was hers, and she couldn't wait to see where it would lead. With her professional life on track, Danielle turned her focus to her personal growth. She signed up for a photography class, something she'd always been curious about but never made time for. She spent weekends exploring her city, camera in hand, capturing everything from bustling markets to quiet tree-lined streets. Her hobby quickly grew into a passion, and she began sharing her work online. To her surprise, her photos garnered attention, with comments pouring in from strangers who appreciated her eye for detail and emotion. One day, as she scrolled through the feedback on her latest post, an idea struck her. What if she turned her photography into something more? What if this newfound love became not just a pastime, but a way to connect with others and share her story? Danielle decided to launch a small side project, a blog she called Reframed. It was a space to showcase her photography while weaving in stories about her journey, her heartbreak, her healing, and the lessons she had learned along the way. She wrote candidly, her words raw and honest, and soon, her blog gained a following. Readers resonated with her vulnerability, leaving comments like, "Your story gives me hope," and "Thank you for reminding me that it's never too late to start over." Danielle was moved by the connection she was building, and for the first time in a long time, She felt a sense of purpose that went beyond herself. Meanwhile, Ethan's absence from her life became more pronounced. He had stopped reaching out, perhaps sensing that she had moved on in ways he couldn't. Danielle heard through mutual friends that he had taken a job in another state, a fresh start of his own. The news didn't stir the pain it once might have. Instead, she felt a quiet relief. Their chapter was truly closed. Julia remained her steadfast support system, cheering her on at every turn. One evening, over a celebratory dinner to mark the launch of Reframed, Julia raised her glass in a toast. "To you, Danny," she said, her smile wide. "For turning heartbreak into beauty. For proving that no matter how bad things get, you can always find your way back to yourself." Danielle clinked her glass against Julia's, her heart swelling with gratitude. "And to you," she replied, "for reminding me I didn't have to do it alone." As the weeks turned into months, Danielle's life continued to blossom. Her work at the agency was challenging but fulfilling, her photography brought her joy, and her blog became a source of inspiration for countless others. She had rebuilt her world from the ground up, piece by piece, and it was more vibrant and fulfilling than she had ever imagined. One crisp autumn morning, Danielle found herself back at the park where she had confronted Ethan months ago. This time she wasn't weighed down by sorrow or anger. She was simply there to enjoy the moment. A walk in the cool air, the crunch of leaves beneath her feet. She paused by the fountain, its gentle flow a soothing backdrop to her thoughts. Pulling out her camera, she framed the scene. Sunlight glinting off the water, children laughing as they fed the ducks, an elderly couple holding hands on a nearby bench. Danielle pressed the shutter, capturing the moment in all its imperfect beauty. As she lowered the camera, she smiled to herself, feeling the weight of her journey settle into a memory. Her life wasn't perfect. It was messy, unpredictable, and full of challenges. But it was hers. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Winter arrived quietly, blanketing Ridgeway in a serene layer of snow. The town looked peaceful, its streets glowing under the soft, golden light of lampposts. Danielle loved this time of year. The stillness, the sense of possibility that came with the close of one chapter, and the beginning of another. Her life had settled into a rhythm, one that felt as natural as breathing. Work at the agency was thriving, and her photography blog, Reframed, had grown beyond what she'd ever expected. She'd been approached by a local gallery to showcase her work, and her first exhibition was just weeks away. On the morning of the exhibition, Danielle stood in the gallery, watching as her photos were carefully hung along the walls. Each image told a story. The Amalfi Coast, quiet moments from Ridgeway, candid portraits of strangers who had unknowingly become part of her journey. Together, they formed a tapestry of resilience and rediscovery. Julia arrived early, her enthusiasm filling the room as she flitted from one photo to the next. "Danny, these are incredible," she said, pausing in front of a shot of Positano at sunset. "You've captured so much more than just places. There's soul in these." Danielle smiled, her chest swelling with pride. "It's been a long road," she said, "but I finally feel like I've found myself again." As guests began trickling in, Danielle mingled, answering questions about her work and soaking in the support of friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had been moved by her photographs. It was a night she would never forget. Later, as the crowd thinned and the gallery grew quiet, Danielle stood in front of one photo in particular, a black and white shot of the park fountain, taken on the day she had realized she was truly free from her past. The image was simple, but to her it represented everything: pain, growth, and the power of letting go. "You've come a long way," Julia said softly, appearing at her side. Danielle nodded, her gaze never leaving the photo. "I have. And I'm not done yet." The following weeks passed in a flurry of new opportunities. The success of her exhibition brought more offers, projects with brands, travel commissions, and even a book deal. Danielle embraced each one, her confidence growing with every step. One evening, as she sorted through submissions for her blog, she came across a message that stopped her in her tracks. It was from a woman named Ella. The subject line read, "You changed my life." Danielle opened the email, her heart pounding. "Dear Danielle, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I had to reach out. I came across your blog during a dark time in my life. Your story, the honesty, the strength you showed, it gave me hope when I had none. I'm leaving an unhealthy relationship because of you, And for the first time I feel like I can breathe. Thank you for sharing your journey. You've inspired me to start my own." Tears welled in Danielle's eyes as she reread the email. She had started Reframed as a way to heal herself, but somewhere along the way it had become something bigger. Her story wasn't just hers, it was a beacon for others, proof that no matter how shattered life might seem, there was always a way to rebuild. On the anniversary of her trip to the Amalfi Coast, Danielle returned to Evergreen Park. The air was crisp, the first hints of spring blooming in the trees. She carried her camera, snapping photos as she walked the familiar paths. She paused by the fountain, her reflection shimmering in the water. For the first time, she didn't see the woman who had been betrayed, who had questioned her worth. She saw someone strong, someone whole. Danielle raised her camera and took one last photo. It was her favorite shot yet. Epilogue. Years later, Danielle's book Reframed, A Journey Through Betrayal and Healing, became a bestseller. She traveled the world, sharing her story and inspiring others to find strength in their own struggles. Her life was far from perfect, but it was authentic, and that was enough. And as she stood on a stage one evening, addressing a packed auditorium, she ended her talk with a simple truth. Life is messy. People will hurt you and you'll stumble along the way. But you are always capable of rising. You are always capable of starting over. The audience erupted in applause, but Danielle didn't need their validation. She smiled, knowing she had already found everything she needed within herself.